The snow fell steadily on the small town of Charleston, South Carolina, its delicate flakes blanketing the cobblestone streets in a luminous white glow. The crisp air carried the sound of Christmas carolers, their harmonies weaving a sense of warmth into the cold December night. The town, alive with holiday spirit, was preparing for one of its most cherished traditions, the Christmas Eve Mass at St. Michael's Cathedral, a historic, opulent church that stood as a testament to the community's faith and resilience. St. Michael's, with its towering spires and stained glass windows that shimmered like jewels in the moonlight, was no ordinary church. Inside, gold leaf accents adorned every corner, and the cavernous ceiling was painted with intricate depictions of biblical scenes. For years, it had been a symbol of prestige and faith, a place where the wealthiest and most devout congregated. On Christmas Eve, it transformed into a beacon of hope, drawing hundreds of worshipers seeking solace, renewal, and connection. That evening, the cathedral was already brimming with life. Families, bundled in their finest coats, shuffled inside, their voices echoing softly against the marble floors. The grand organ began to play a hauntingly beautiful rendition of O Holy Night, setting the tone for the night's service. Among the crowd, the wealthy Montgomery family stood out. Helen Montgomery, a prominent philanthropist, was accompanied by her son, Daniel, a reserved teenager struggling to find his place in the world. Helen, always poised, carried an air of importance, while Daniel seemed lost in his thoughts, his eyes wandering as if searching for something, or someone, that could make him believe in the magic of Christmas again. Meanwhile, just outside the grand doors of the cathedral, a different kind of presence stirred. A small white cat, its fur as pristine as the falling snow, crept through the shadows of the churchyard. Its emerald eyes glimmered in the dim light as it surveyed the scene with cautious curiosity. This was no ordinary stray. There was an elegance in its movements, a quiet determination as it padded silently through the snow. Unbeknownst to the congregation, this seemingly unassuming creature was about to change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The cat, later referred to as Eve by those who would come to adore her, was drawn to the warm glow spilling out of the cathedral's stained glass windows. It wasn't hunger or cold that guided her steps. There was something else, an inexplicable pull that led her to this place on this night. She paused at the cathedral's massive oak doors, her small paw prints trailing in the snow behind her. A gust of wind blew the door ajar just enough for Eve to slip inside unnoticed. The cathedral's interior, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, was a world away from the icy streets outside. Eve's tiny figure moved cautiously across the polished floors, her reflection mirrored in their gleaming surface. As she ventured further into the cathedral, a hushed awe seemed to follow her. Those who noticed her presence, ushers, parishioners, even the choir, paused, their conversations and preparations faltering as they caught sight of the pure white cat. Something about her was otherworldly, almost ethereal, as if she belonged not to the mundane world, but to the very heart of this sacred space. Helen Montgomery was the first among the prominent attendees to notice the cat. She nudged Daniel, pointing discreetly at the feline. "What's a cat doing in here?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of curiosity and mild disapproval. Daniel, however, was transfixed. There was something in the way the cat carried itself, calm, confident, yet strangely vulnerable, that resonated with him. Without thinking, he stepped away from his mother's side, following the cat's quiet path as it weaved through the pews. The service began, the bishop's deep voice filling the cathedral with a prayer for peace and unity. Yet, as the congregation knelt and rose in unison, their attention often drifted to the small figure of Eve. She had perched herself near the altar, her white fur glowing in the candlelight, her green eyes fixed on the bishop as if she, too, was participating in the sacred ceremony. Some found it charming, others found it distracting, but no one could deny the odd sense of purpose in her presence. As the choir began to sing, "Hark, the herald angels sing," Eve did something that left everyone in the cathedral speechless. She leapt gracefully onto the altar, her movements so fluid it was as if she had been carried by an unseen force. Gasps rippled through the congregation. The bishop paused mid-sentence, his eyes wide with surprise. Eve sat on the edge of the altar, her tail curled neatly around her paws, her gaze scanning the crowd as though she had something to say, something that transcended words. In that moment, the opulence of St. Michael's seemed to fade into the background. The grandeur of the gold leaf accents and the dazzling stained glass windows paled in comparison to the silent, profound presence of this little creature. It was as if the entire cathedral held its breath, waiting for something extraordinary to unfold. No one could have anticipated that this unassuming white cat on this Christmas Eve would become the symbol of a miracle that would forever change their lives. The cathedral was frozen in silence. Eve sat poised on the altar, her green eyes glowing with an enigmatic intensity that seemed to pierce the hearts of everyone present. The bishop, caught between astonishment and reverence, took a hesitant step toward the cat but stopped as she turned her gaze toward him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a serene authority that made even the most skeptical among the congregation wonder. Was this more than a simple stray? Helen Montgomery whispered sharply to her son, "Daniel, come back here." But Daniel ignored her. He was no longer thinking about appearances or the rules that govern spaces like St. Michael's. He was captivated. It wasn't just the cat's sudden leap onto the altar. It was what she seemed to represent. For months, he had been grappling with a deep sense of disconnection. His father's passing earlier that year had left him numb, and no amount of his mother's charity galas or church attendance could fill the void. But now, staring at the small white cat that had captivated an entire congregation, Daniel felt something stir inside him. A whisper of hope, faint but undeniable. As the choir faltered, their voices wavering under the weight of the unexpected interruption, the bishop finally spoke. "It seems," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "that we have an unexpected visitor tonight. Perhaps even a sign." He attempted a smile, but his words only deepened the growing tension in the room. The murmurs began almost immediately. Some of the wealthier congregants exchanged disapproving glances, their carefully curated evening disrupted by what they saw as an unwelcome intrusion. Others, particularly the older members of the church, began whispering about omens and miracles, their voices tinged with both awe and apprehension. Helen was among the first to stand. "Surely someone needs to remove the animal," she said, her voice cutting through the hushed murmurs. But before anyone could act, a voice rang out from the back of the cathedral. "Leave her be." It was a man who rarely spoke in church, a janitor named Frank, known to most simply as Old Frank. He was a quiet figure who cleaned the pews and polished the brass fixtures, but seldom interacted with the congregation. Tonight, however, his voice carried an authority that silenced even Helen. "Maybe she's here for a reason," he added, his eyes fixed on the cat. The bishop hesitated. St. Michael's was a place of tradition, and allowing an animal, no matter how peculiar, on the altar during one of the most sacred nights of the year was unthinkable. Yet, as he looked into the crowd, he saw something he hadn't expected. Tears in the eyes of some of the parishioners. There was something about the cat's presence that had touched a nerve. Awakening emotions buried beneath layers of routine and decorum. As the bishop debated how to proceed, Eve stood and began to move again. Her movements were deliberate, her steps echoing faintly in the cavernous space. She descended from the altar and began walking down the center aisle, her tail held high like a banner. The congregation parted instinctively, making way for her as she passed. She stopped in front of a young woman seated near the back of the cathedral. The woman, dressed in a threadbare coat, was clearly out of place among the more affluent worshippers. She clutched a bundled infant to her chest, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Eve sat before her, staring up at her with an intensity that made the young woman gasp. I don't know what she wants," the woman stammered, looking around nervously. Frank stepped forward, his weathered face softening. "Maybe she's here for you," he said gently. The woman shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I only came in because it was warm," she confessed. "I don't belong here." At that moment, something shifted in the room. The grandeur of St. Michael's, with all its gold and marble, seemed to fall away, leaving only the raw humanity of those inside. The wealthy congregants who had spent the evening preoccupied with their own lives suddenly found themselves confronted with the stark reality of this young woman's plight. And at the center of it all was the cat, silent, unyielding, her presence demanding attention without a single sound. Helen, who had remained standing, slowly sat back down. Her perfectly coiffed hair and designer coat felt absurdly out of place in the face of the young woman's vulnerability. She glanced at Daniel, who was still watching the cat with rapt attention, and for the first time in years, she felt unsure of herself. Was this cat, this stray, uninvited creature, a message? And if so, what was it trying to say? Eve didn't linger with the young woman. She rose and continued her slow journey through the cathedral, stopping occasionally to meet the eyes of those she passed. Each time, the effect was the same, a quiet unraveling of the walls people had built around their hearts. By the time she returned to the altar, the atmosphere in the cathedral had transformed. The murmurs had ceased, replaced by a profound silence that felt almost sacred. The bishop cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Perhaps tonight," he said, "we are being reminded of something. That faith is not in the grandeur of a building or the wealth of its congregation, but in the small, quiet moments where we see each other, truly see each other, as God's children." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into every corner of the cathedral. Eve lay down at the base of the altar, her white fur glowing in the candlelight. She seemed at peace, as if her work was done, though no one fully understood what that work had been. For the rest of the service, the congregation was subdued, their voices softer, their prayers more heartfelt. And when the final hymn was sung and the congregation began to file out into the snowy night, many paused to glance back at the cat still lying by the altar. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others simply stared, their hearts heavy with thoughts they couldn't yet put into words. The heavy oak doors of St. Michael's swung shut behind the last of the congregation, leaving the cathedral in a deep, almost reverent quiet. Snow continued to fall outside, its soft patter against the stained glass windows, the only sound in the now empty space. Inside, Eve remained curled at the base of the altar, a small, still figure in the vastness of the cathedral. The bishop lingered near the pulpit, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the cat, his mind a whirl of questions and doubts. As the cleaning crew began their nightly duties, Frank the janitor approached the altar with deliberate steps. He crouched down a few feet away from Eve, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "You caused quite a stir tonight, little one," he murmured. Eve lifted her head slightly, her green eyes locking onto his, and for a moment, Frank felt as though the cat could see straight into his soul. "You're not just a stray, are you?" he asked softly, though he expected no answer. Behind him, the young woman from earlier, the one clutching her baby, lingered awkwardly by the back pews. Her name was Maria, and she wasn't from Charleston. She had arrived in town just weeks earlier with nothing but a small suitcase, a 3-month-old infant, and a heart full of desperation. Her husband had abandoned them, and her family lived thousands of miles away. The streets had been her home for days before she'd stumbled into the warmth of St. Michael's, hoping for a reprieve from the biting cold. Frank turned to her and gestured for her to come closer. "It's okay," he said. "You can stay a while longer if you need to." Maria hesitated but eventually approached, her baby stirring in her arms. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't know where else to go." Frank shook his head. "No trouble at all. You're welcome here." He glanced back at Eve, who had now stood and was watching Maria intently. "Looks like you've got a friend, anyway." Maria smiled faintly, but tears welled up in her eyes. She sank onto a nearby bench, the weight of her exhaustion and fear pressing down on her. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought maybe tonight, in a place like this, I'd feel something. Hope, maybe. But I don't know if I even believe in that anymore." Frank sat beside her, his gaze soft. "Funny thing about hope," he said. "It doesn't always come the way you expect. Sometimes it sneaks up on you, quiet-like. Sometimes it looks like a miracle, and other times—" He gestured toward Eve, who had jumped gracefully off the altar and was now rubbing against Maria's leg. "It's a little harder to recognize." Maria let out a shaky laugh, her tears falling freely now. She reached down to stroke Eve's fur, surprised by its warmth. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She feels safe." Frank nodded. "She's got a way about her, doesn't she? Like she knows something we don't." As the two sat there sharing a moment of quiet understanding, Helen Montgomery and Daniel re-entered the cathedral. Helen had forgotten her gloves, and despite her irritation at having to return, she couldn't shake the events of the evening from her mind. She spotted Frank and Maria near the altar and frowned, her discomfort with the situation evident. "What's going on here?" Helen asked, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "Shouldn't the church be closed by now?" Daniel, however, didn't wait for an answer. He had noticed Eve immediately and walked past his mother, his steps purposeful. He knelt beside the cat, his usually stoic expression softening as he reached out to pet her. Eve leaned into his touch, purring softly, and for the first time in months, Daniel smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that caught Helen off guard. "Daniel, really," Helen said, her tone exasperated. "It's just a cat." "It's not just a cat, Mom," Daniel replied, his voice firm but quiet. "Don't you see? She's different. She's here for a reason." Helen sighed, but before she could argue, Maria spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "He's right." She looked at Helen, her expression a mixture of gratitude and defiance. "This cat, she brought something into this place tonight, something I think we all needed." Helen opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. She glanced at Frank, who gave her a knowing look, and then back at Daniel, whose eyes shone with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. For the first time, she felt a crack in her carefully maintained armor, a nagging sense that perhaps she had been blind to something important, something greater than her own understanding. The turning point came when the baby in Maria's arms began to fuss. Eve immediately responded, jumping onto the bench beside Maria and curling up next to the infant. The baby quieted almost instantly, its tiny fingers reaching out to touch the cat's fur. The sight was so simple, so pure, that it took everyone by surprise. Helen, who had spent the evening judging Maria from a distance, suddenly felt a pang of guilt. This young woman wasn't just a stranger in need. She was a mother, a person with a story, a life full of struggles Helen had never bothered to consider. In that moment, something shifted within Helen. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Maria, is it?" she asked, her voice softer now. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Maria hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "No, ma'am," she said finally. "But I don't want to be a burden." Helen shook her head. "It's no burden. You can stay with us, at least until you're back on your feet." Maria stared at her in disbelief, her eyes filling with tears once more. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much." Daniel watched his mother, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: pride. He looked down at Eve, who seemed to be watching the scene with quiet satisfaction, her tail twitching ever so slightly. As the snow continued to fall outside, the small group remained in the warmth of St. Michael's. And though none of them said it aloud, they all knew that something extraordinary had happened that night. Eve's arrival had been no accident. It had been a catalyst, a quiet miracle that brought strangers together, softened hearts, and reminded everyone present of the true meaning of Christmas. The Montgomery home was not where Maria had expected to end her Christmas Eve. As she stepped through the grand double doors, cradling her infant and clutching a borrowed coat, she was overwhelmed by the warmth and opulence of the space. High ceilings adorned with chandeliers, a crackling fireplace surrounded by marble, and the faint scent of pine and cinnamon reminded her that this was a world far removed from the one she had lived in for the past few weeks. Yet despite its grandeur, Maria couldn't shake the uneasy feeling of being an intruder. Helen led her inside, speaking softly but with a kindness that Maria hadn't expected. "There's a guest room on the first floor," Helen said, gesturing down a hallway. "It's nothing extravagant, but it's quiet, and you'll have everything you need for tonight." "Thank you," Maria replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Helen paused, her fingers brushing against the edge of a gilded banister. She glanced at Daniel, who had been unusually quiet during the drive home, but was now holding Eve in his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. For a brief moment, Helen felt the weight of the cat's piercing green eyes on her, and it was as though Eve were silently urging her forward, pushing her beyond the boundaries of her tightly controlled world. "You don't need to repay me." Helen finally said, "Just rest, that's all I ask." Maria nodded and allowed herself to be led away, the tension in her shoulders slowly melting as she disappeared down the hallway. Daniel lingered in the foyer, still cradling Eve, who now purred softly against his chest. He turned to his mother, his voice hesitant but firm. "You did the right thing tonight, Mom," he said. Helen sighed, sinking into a nearby armchair. "I hope so, Daniel," she replied. "I really do." But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about Maria. For years, Helen had busied herself with charity work, hosting fundraisers and donating to causes that kept her name in the headlines. It had always felt like enough, like she was doing her part to make the world a better place. Yet tonight, a white cat and a young woman with nowhere to go had revealed cracks in that facade, forcing her to confront a truth she'd long avoided. That true compassion wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about opening your heart, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant letting go of control. By morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving Charleston blanketed in a shimmering white coat. The town was quiet, save for the occasional sound of shovels scraping against sidewalks. Inside the Montgomery home, the world felt equally still. Helen found herself awake earlier than usual, drawn to the soft hum of voices coming from the kitchen. When she entered, she found Maria sitting at the table, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Her baby was asleep in a makeshift crib, a basket lined with blankets that Daniel had put together the night before. Daniel himself sat across from Maria, Eve perched contentedly in his lap. They were talking in low voices, their words punctuated by quiet laughter. It was a scene so simple, so human, that Helen felt her chest tighten. Maria looked up as Helen entered, her expression instantly shifting to one of gratitude and nervousness. "Good morning," Maria said. "I hope I didn't wake anyone." "You didn't," Helen replied, her voice softer than usual. She poured herself a cup of coffee and joined them at the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Eve's gentle purring, a soothing rhythm that seemed to fill the room with peace. Finally, Helen broke the silence. "Maria," she began, "do you have a plan? For what's next, I mean?" Maria hesitated, her fingers tightening around her mug. "I've been looking for work," she said. "But it's hard with the baby. I thought maybe I'd find a shelter, at least until I can figure something out." Helen's gaze shifted to Eve, who was now staring directly at her as if urging her to say more. The thought of Maria and her child returning to the streets felt unbearable, especially now that she had seen their humanity up close. Helen took a deep breath. "You don't need to rush into anything," she said. "You can stay here for as long as you need. We'll help you get on your feet." Maria's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. I can't accept that. You've already done so much." "It's not up for debate," Helen said gently but firmly. "Consider it a Christmas gift." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, and she nodded, unable to find the words to express her gratitude. Daniel reached across the table and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, a gesture that filled Helen with an unexpected sense of pride. For so long, she had worried about Daniel's detachment, his growing disinterest in the world around him. But now, watching him connect with Maria, seeing the kindness in his eyes, Helen realized that her son hadn't been lost. He had simply been waiting for something, or someone, to help him find his way. Over the following weeks, Maria became part of the household. She helped with chores, cared for her baby, and even began assisting with Helen's charity work. It wasn't long before Helen realized that Maria's presence had transformed the entire dynamic of the house. The once cavernous space, so often filled with silence, was now alive with laughter and purpose. And at the center of it all was Eve, who seemed to have claimed her role as both guardian and guide. Eve's presence was a constant source of comfort, not just for Maria and her baby, but for Helen and Daniel as well. She had a way of appearing at just the right moment, curling up beside Helen when she was lost in thought, nuzzling Daniel when he needed encouragement, or sitting by Maria's crib as if standing watch over the child. It was as if the cat had been sent to remind them all of something they had forgotten: the power of connection, of love, of faith. Maria found a job at a local daycare, and with Helen's help, she began saving for a place of her own. But even as her independence grew, she chose to stay close to the Montgomerys, visiting frequently and bringing her baby to play with Eve, who had become the child's constant companion. As for Daniel, he began volunteering at the daycare where Maria worked, inspired by her resilience and the bond they had formed. He discovered a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and with it came a newfound confidence that made Helen's heart swell with pride. One evening, as the family sat together by the fire, Eve curled up in her usual spot on the hearth. Helen looked around the room and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The path that had brought them all together was far from ordinary, but it was one she would never trade. Months later, on a warm spring afternoon, the Montgomery household gathered on the back patio. The garden, once meticulously maintained but lifeless, had burst into bloom, vibrant flowers of every color spilling over the edges of planters, their petals dancing in the breeze. Helen watched as Maria's baby, now toddling unsteadily on chubby legs, chased after Eve, giggling uncontrollably. The white cat moved just fast enough to stay ahead, occasionally pausing to let the child catch up before darting away again. Daniel sat nearby, sketching in a notebook. He'd rediscovered his love of art, a passion he'd abandoned after his father's passing, and now spent hours capturing moments like these. Maria's warm smile, the baby's laughter, Eve's ever-watchful presence. Helen marveled at how much her son had changed. Gone was the distant, brooding boy she'd feared was slipping away from her. In his place was a young man filled with purpose and compassion, his heart open in a way she hadn't seen since he was a child. Maria approached Helen, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to her with a smile, her gratitude still evident in every interaction. "It's beautiful here," Maria said, glancing around the garden. "It's hard to believe how much has changed since Christmas." Helen nodded, her gaze softening as she watched Eve finally let the baby catch her, curling up contentedly as tiny hands stroked her fur. "It is," she agreed. "Sometimes I wonder if we would have ever met if it weren't for her." Maria followed Helen's gaze, her expression thoughtful. "She brought us together," she said simply. "All of us." Helen's heart swelled at the words. For so long she had defined her life by success, appearances, and the approval of others. But Eve, this little white cat who had appeared out of nowhere on that snowy Christmas Eve, had stripped all of that away. She had shown Helen the power of vulnerability, the importance of truly seeing others, and the joy that came from opening her heart to those in need. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Helen felt a deep sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, uncertainties, but it was full of love, connection, and the quiet miracles that often went unnoticed. Eve stretched and stood, her emerald eyes catching the last rays of sunlight. For a moment she looked directly at Helen, her gaze filled with an almost human understanding. Helen smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew the words weren't enough. Eve blinked slowly, as if to say, "You're welcome." And with that, the cat padded away, her white fur glowing softly in the fading light, leaving behind a family forever changed by her quiet, miraculous presence.